I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but life often takes you to places you don't expect. My name is Olivia, and I'm 46 years old. I've been a single mother for many years, raising my son Noah on my own. Noah is 23 now, and we've always had a close relationship, just the two of us navigating life's challenges together. One evening, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. Noah had been burning the candle at both ends, working long shifts at his job while also preparing for his final exams. When he walked through the front door of our small apartment, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He barely managed to kick off his shoes before collapsing onto the couch. "I'm wiped out, Mom," he mumbled. "I feel like I could sleep for a week." "You've been working too hard," I said gently, brushing a strand of hair off his forehead. "Why don't you lie down for a bit in my room? The living room is too cold tonight." He nodded and followed me into my bedroom, dragging his feet like every step was a battle. I tucked him in under the warm quilt that had always been my comfort during chilly nights. At first, everything felt normal, a mother helping her son get some much-needed rest. But as I lay down next to him to keep him company, something shifted in the air. Noah turned toward me under the blanket, moving closer as if searching for warmth. I didn't think much of it at first. It was instinctive, a habit from when he was younger. But then, his arm wrapped around me gently, pulling me closer. My breath hitched, and I hesitated for a moment before settling back into the pillow. He probably just needed comfort after such a draining day, I told myself. I could feel his body warmth against mine and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The room was so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat growing louder. I stayed still, not wanting to wake him or make him feel uncomfortable. But as the minutes passed, I became acutely aware of how close we were. The warmth between us wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something I couldn't easily explain. Noah shifted again, this time tightening his grip slightly. My body tensed, unsure of what to do. My mind was at war with itself, one part urging me to move away, while another part stayed frozen, unsure if I even wanted to. I told myself that this was just a brief, awkward moment that would pass, but when his hand brushed against my arm, tracing small, gentle circles on my skin, I felt a shiver run through me. It was such a small gesture, yet it felt electric. My heart raced, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. I didn't want Noah to notice how much this moment was affecting me. I reminded myself again that he was my son, and this was nothing more than a moment of comfort. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The weight of his arm on me, the warmth of his body pressed so close, and the softness of his breath against my neck, it was all too much. My thoughts spiraled, filled with questions I didn't want to face. Why did this feel different? Why couldn't I ignore the way his touch sent waves of emotion through me? And then, Noah lifted his head slightly and looked at me. His eyes held a softness I hadn't seen before, a mixture of vulnerability and something deeper, something that made my breath catch. His gaze lingered on mine as if he were searching for reassurance or permission. I tried to smile, hoping it would break the tension, but it only seemed to deepen it. He rested his hand on my arm, his touch warm and steady. His fingers moved slowly, absent-mindedly, as if he didn't realize what he was doing. But I felt every movement, every brush of his fingertips, like a spark igniting something inside me that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to speak, to say something that would ease the intensity between us, but the words wouldn't come. The air in the room felt heavier, like we were both trapped in a moment we didn't know how to escape. "Mom," Noah whispered, his voice barely audible, "are you okay?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm fine," I whispered back, though my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His gaze stayed locked on mine for a moment longer, before he rested his head on my shoulder again. I could feel his breath against my collarbone, warm and steady. The warmth of his body pressed against mine only grew, and the tension between us refused to fade. I lay there, wide awake, while Noah's breathing slowly returned to the steady rhythm of sleep. My mind was racing, torn between logic and the confusing emotions swirling inside me. I told myself over and over that this was just an innocent moment, that it didn't mean anything, but the longer I lay there, the harder it became to convince myself. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, I carefully slipped out of bed, making sure not to wake him. My feet felt heavy as I made my way to the kitchen, my mind still clouded with confusion. I stood by the sink, staring out at the city streets below, trying to make sense of what had happened. The warmth of Noah's touch still lingered on my skin, and I couldn't shake the memory of the way his gaze had held mine. I wanted to believe that things would go back to normal once he woke up, that this was just a passing moment brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something between us had shifted, and I wasn't sure if things could ever go back to the way they were before. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, hoping that time would provide the clarity I desperately needed. But as the morning light continued to fill the apartment, I realized that the questions in my heart weren't going away anytime soon. I felt a mixture of confusion and warmth, an unexpected combination that held me still. Noah didn't seem to notice my internal struggle. He just stayed beside me, his hand moving softly along my arm, comforting, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His breathing remained calm, his eyes closing again, and for a moment I wondered if he was falling asleep. But then his hand shifted, moving slowly upward, brushing lightly against my skin. A chill ran through me, and that's when he opened his eyes, looking directly into mine. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a question lingering there, as if he were silently asking if this was okay, if I felt the same strange pull that he did. My breath hitched, and I barely managed to whisper his name. Noah, the word escaping my lips like a fragile plea. I wanted to stop this, to pull away and create distance between us, but somehow I couldn't move. The tension binding us together was too strong, like the calm before a storm, quietly building in the silence. Neither of us spoke, but the air between us felt heavy, filled with words we couldn't say. Then, almost naturally, as if he were moving on instinct, he leaned in closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with fragmented thoughts, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back. I felt torn, caught between my role as his mother and the strange feelings that had surfaced so unexpectedly. As he inched closer, I felt my breath catch, and every logical thought I had faded away, leaving only that moment between us. Noah's hand rested gently on my shoulder now, his fingers lingering as if he too was hesitating. The world around us seemed distant, like a blur at the edges of my vision. All I could focus on was the warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a sound I could almost hear. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to calm myself, silently urging my body to back away, to break the closeness that felt so confusing and overwhelming. But before I could act, I felt his hand move again, this time gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from my face. It was such a simple, caring gesture, but it made my heart ache in ways I couldn't understand. I opened my eyes, and there he was, so close that I could see every small detail. His face, just inches away, revealed tiny freckles I'd never noticed before. The gentle curve of his lips, the way his eyes searched mine, all of it made my breath catch again. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that mirrored my own. I could see that he was just as lost in this moment as I was. We stayed like that, suspended in the quiet, as if time itself had stopped. My mind spun in a whirlwind of questions and doubts, struggling to process the emotions flooding through me, but my body remained still, unable to break free from the invisible force pulling me toward him. I looked at him, the boy I had raised, the son I had known for 23 years, and yet in this moment, he felt like someone entirely new to me. Just when I thought we'd stay frozen in that charged silence forever, Noah pulled back slightly, breaking the trance. He looked away, almost embarrassed, and let out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. His sudden movement jolted me back to reality, making me realize just how close we had been. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rush of emotions swirling inside me. I hoped he hadn't noticed how much I was struggling. Sorry, Mom, he said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. I didn't mean to make things weird. He avoided my gaze, his eyes focused on the floor. I could see a faint blush creeping across his cheeks, the color betraying his own inner turmoil. He was just as confused as I was, and it was written all over his face. I wanted to say something to comfort him, to tell him that everything was okay, that we could brush this off and move on like nothing had happened. But the words got stuck in my throat. For the first time in a long while, I felt awkward around my own son. After a moment of hesitation, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. I forced a small smile, hoping it would ease the tension hanging between us. It's okay, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself. His shoulders relaxed slightly under my touch, but the awkwardness lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on both of us. Neither of us knew what to say next, and for a moment we just sat there, caught in the confusion of what had just happened. The room was quiet again, but inside me, a storm of emotions still raged. I silently prayed that when the morning came, we'd both find the clarity we desperately needed. It's all right, Noah, I said, my voice soft and steady. It's just, well, it's been the two of us for so long. We're probably both feeling a little lost. He nodded, and I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes. For a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease, the weight of the previous moment starting to fade. But just as I allowed myself to breathe again, the doorbell rang. The sudden noise jolted us both, snapping us back to reality and breaking whatever unspoken connection had formed between us. I quickly stood up, my heart still racing, and made my way to the door. I was grateful for the interruption, for the brief reprieve from the swirling emotions I wasn't ready to confront. When I opened the door, our neighbor Mark was standing there. Mark had always been friendly, someone reliable, the type of person I could count on when I needed help. He smiled warmly, but his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, and that's when I realized I was still carrying the strange energy from the moment with Noah. I took a breath, trying to compose myself and hoping that Mark didn't notice anything unusual. Hey, Olivia, he said, his voice warm and familiar. I thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything. It's been pretty cold lately, and I can help out if you're having any heating issues. A wave of relief washed over me, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to relax. Oh, thank you, Mark, I replied with a small smile. Actually, the house has been a bit chilly. I'd appreciate the help. Mark stepped inside, and as he did, I felt Noah's presence behind me. I turned slightly and saw him standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, our eyes met, and I caught something in his gaze, a brief flicker of what looked like jealousy. He masked it quickly, but the moment stayed with me, leaving me wondering if he was feeling more than he was willing to admit. Mark busied himself checking the heater, asking me questions about how things were at home. We made small talk, the kind that would normally ease my mind, but I couldn't fully focus. My attention kept drifting to Noah, who hadn't moved from the hallway. His gaze never left us, his silent intensity adding a new layer of tension to the room. I could sense his discomfort, and it left me torn, caught between wanting to engage with Mark and being painfully aware of Noah's presence. After a few minutes, Mark turned to me with a warm, reassuring smile. Everything looks good, Olivia, but if you need anything else, don't hesitate to call. Thanks, Mark, I said, walking him to the door. As soon as it closed behind him, the tension in the room seemed to thicken. When I turned around, Noah was still standing there, his arms crossed, his expression serious. Are you okay, Noah? I asked softly, trying to understand what was going through his mind. He shrugged, glancing down for a moment before meeting my gaze. His voice was quiet. Yeah, I'm fine. I just didn't expect Mark to stop by, that's all. I wanted to say more, to reach out and help him untangle whatever he was feeling, but before I could, he walked past me and headed to his room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me standing there in the silence. I felt a strange mixture of relief, confusion, and a lingering ache I couldn't quite understand. I stared at his closed door, replaying everything in my mind. The closeness we had shared earlier, the way his gaze had lingered when Mark was here, and the unspoken tension that seemed ready to bubble over again. Unable to shake the weight of it all, I retreated to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, running the moment over and over in my mind. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever, but I also wasn't sure how to confront it. A soft knock on my door broke me from my thoughts, and my heart jumped as I wondered if Noah had come back. "Come in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Noah opened the door and stepped inside, his face unreadable. He crossed the room and sat next to me on the bed, his gaze fixed on his hands as silence settled over us. The air felt heavy with everything unsaid, the weight of emotions we were both struggling to manage. "Mom," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry if I made things weird earlier. He trailed off, clearly fighting to find the right words. I looked at him, feeling the tension in his shoulders, the hesitation in his voice. "It's okay," I wanted to say, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. Instead, I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, hoping the gesture could bridge the gap between us. I placed my hand gently on Noah's, giving it a soft squeeze. "Noah, it's okay," I said quietly. "Maybe we're both just feeling a little lost right now. It's been just us for so long, and sometimes things can get confusing." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on his hands. For a moment, the silence stretched between us, heavy and fragile. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. There was a mix of emotions swirling there. Uncertainty, vulnerability, something I couldn't quite define. His voice was soft when he spoke, almost as if he was afraid to say the words out loud. "I just feel..." The ache in my chest deepened, mirroring his confusion. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to reach out, to wrap my arms around him and tell him everything would be okay, but I hesitated. What if that wasn't what he needed? What if it made things even more complicated? So instead, I stayed still, letting the silence speak for both of us. Finally, I took a deep breath and met his gaze. "Noah, maybe we just need to take a step back," I said gently. "It's okay to feel close, but it's also okay to need space to figure things out." He nodded again, slower this time, as if processing my words. Then, without warning, he leaned his head on my shoulder, just like he used to when he was younger. The gesture was familiar, comforting, but now it carried a strange new weight that I couldn't ignore. Still, I felt my heart soften, and I instinctively wrapped my arm around him, pulling him close. For a moment, it felt safe, simple. Even though I knew the questions between us hadn't been answered, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we didn't need all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to take things one step at a time, to figure it out together, even if it was complicated. We sat there quietly, holding on to each other as if the warmth of our connection could make the confusion disappear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The comfort of being close was mixed with something else, something unsettling, like a current beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. After a while, Noah lifted his head and looked at me, his face serious. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't know what to do with these feelings. I don't want to make things harder for us, but I can't ignore it either." His words hung in the air like a question he didn't dare ask outright. My throat tightened and I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I searched for the right thing to say. But before I could speak, there was a knock on the door. We both jumped, startled. The knock was firm, almost urgent, as if whoever was on the other side sensed something was wrong. Feeling a sudden wave of nervousness, I stood up and walked to the door. When I opened it, Mark was standing there, concern etched across his face. "Olivia, sorry to bother you," he said. "I just wanted to check if everything's all right. You seemed a bit off earlier." I glanced over my shoulder at Noah, who was watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. I tried to steady my breath and kept my voice calm. "Thanks, Mark. We're fine, really, just having a quiet evening." Mark nodded, though his gaze lingered, flicking between me and Noah as if he could sense the tension. "All right, just remember, I'm next door if you need anything." "Thanks, Mark," I said again. When I closed the door, I turned back to find Noah still standing in the same spot, watching me with that same intensity. Slowly, he walked toward me, each step deliberate, as if he were fighting an internal battle with every inch of ground he covered. My heart started racing all over again. The air between us felt thick, charged with everything unsaid, but just as he reached me, he stopped. His expression shifted, a mix of frustration and hesitation flashing across his face, as if he were at war with himself. I wanted to reach for him, to bridge the gap between us, but I couldn't move. My breath caught as I waited, unsure of what would happen next. In the silence, we stood there, both unsure of how to move forward, both painfully aware that whatever this was, it couldn't be ignored for much longer. I nodded, my heart aching with the same swirl of conflicted emotions. "You're right, Noah. We both need to think things through. Let's not rush this." He nodded again, and for a moment we stood there, close yet careful, as if we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us could fully control. It felt like both an ending and a beginning, something undefined and fragile. As Noah turned and walked toward his room, the weight of the moment settled over me. I watched him disappear down the hallway, my mind spinning with uncertainty. What would the future hold for us? If you'd like to hear the rest of our story, let us know in the comments, and we'll share what happens next in part 2. It all began on a humid spring morning in Savannah, Georgia. The sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the narrow streets lined with oak trees dripping in Spanish moss. As I stood outside the colonial-style White House, the weight of the morning's heat mixed with nerves making my scarf cling uncomfortably to my neck. This was my first job in America, worlds away from the bustling market stalls of Tangier, Morocco, where I had spent most of my life. I never thought I'd leave my family or the world I had known for 30 years, but fate often unfolds in ways we can't predict. The Bennetts, a well-to-do family of 4, needed a nanny, and I needed a fresh start. The job wasn't just about earning a paycheck. It was about proving to myself and to my family that I could thrive here. I was 30, single, and determined to build a life of my own. Charlotte Bennett, the mother, was sophisticated and graceful, with an aura that seemed to exude control. She greeted me that day wearing a crisp navy blouse and beige slacks, her dark hair tied back in a sleek ponytail. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were sharp, as if she were constantly assessing everything around her. Then there was her husband, Daniel Bennett. Tall, with an easy demeanor and a kind laugh, Daniel had sandy brown hair and wore glasses that added to his soft-spoken charm. Their 2 children, Ellie and Jonah, were 7 and 4, spirited, curious, and full of energy. I was nervous, naturally. I had never worked as a nanny before, but Charlotte seemed to take comfort in my experience as the oldest of 5 siblings. "You'll be fine," she said reassuringly. Still, I could sense her perfectionist tendencies as she handed me a binder filled with daily routines, emergency contacts, and even instructions on how she preferred the children's clothes folded. The first few weeks passed without incident. I'd wake before sunrise to make breakfast, pack Ellie's lunch, and then spend the day keeping Jonah entertained. My days were a blur of reading storybooks, building pillow forts, and cleaning up spilled juice. By the time I retreated to my modest room on the top floor at night, I was exhausted but fulfilled. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. It was a month into the job, and I was kneeling on the kitchen floor, wiping up a mess of orange juice that Jonah had spilled, when I noticed Daniel watching me from across the room. He leaned against the counter, his gaze soft and thoughtful. "You're really good with them," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. Startled, I looked up. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Bennett." "Call me Daniel," he replied with a warm smile. I nodded, feeling a flush creep up my neck. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he genuinely meant it. Back home, men rarely spoke to women with such kindness unless there was an expectation attached. But Daniel seemed different. After that, I began noticing him more. How he'd ask if I'd eaten, how he offered to carry the groceries without hesitation, and how he lingered in the kitchen while I cooked. Meanwhile, Charlotte's demanding corporate job often kept her away from home, leaving me alone with the kids and Daniel more frequently. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, Daniel walked in and leaned against the doorway. "Don't you ever get tired?" he asked. "Tired of what?" I replied without looking up. "Of taking care of everyone," he said softly. I shrugged. "It's my job, I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he murmured. His words stayed with me long after that conversation. In my culture, women were expected to give selflessly, to serve without question. But Daniel's simple acknowledgement of my efforts made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. I tried to ignore the warmth his presence stirred within me, reminding myself of the boundaries that needed to remain intact. I was a guest in their home, a Muslim woman bound by tradition and faith. Yet, day by day, it became harder to ignore. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Daniel offered to help. As we stood side by side at the sink, our hands occasionally brushed against each other. "You're special," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you know that." I froze, my breath hitching. "Daniel, please." "I'm sorry," he interrupted, stepping back. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But he had already crossed a line, and so had I. Because deep down, I knew I didn't want him to stop. My heart raced as I tried to reconcile the swirling emotions within me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the life I had left behind, the traditions I had been raised with, and the expectations I had always carried. But here, in this house so far from home, I was beginning to question everything. I didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: nothing would be the same again. There were boundaries I knew I could never cross, no matter how kind or handsome my employer was. But life, as I would soon learn, had its own plans. That summer seemed to stretch endlessly, with long, sweltering days that bled into humid nights. Charlotte's work trips became more frequent, leaving Daniel and me to manage the children on our own. Slowly, the boundaries I had been so determined to keep began to blur. At first, it was innocent. Shared jokes, stolen glances, and casual conversations that lasted a little too long. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. I often heard my mother's voice in my head, stern and unwavering. Layla, remember who you are. This world will tempt you, but you must stay true to yourself. I had always prided myself on my self-control, on my ability to resist the distractions of the modern world. But Daniel was different. He wasn't just temptation. He was kindness, familiarity, and warmth in a place where I had once felt like a stranger.